So, Chris, thanks for doing this. First off, I think as the official spokesman for crypto Twitter, I'm excited to have this chat with you, and we've gone back and forth on this topic a couple of times. As I am deeply skeptical, as I think a lot of people in this room are, about central bank digital currencies, and you have a nuanced, contrarian view of CBDCs and how they could fit into the digital money spectrum. Let's start there. I have a lightning round question at the end related to your former background as chair of the CFTC and potentially, hopefully involved in the SEC or some capacity in the next administration. But I want to focus on the digital dollar project to start, and maybe you can just take a step back and help people understand what you've been up to the last couple of years since you've been in the private sector and kind of working in this space full time to think about what a digital dollar could look like that isn't dystopian.
Yeah, so Ryan, as you know, I left the CFTC at the end of my term in 2019, and in January 2020 launched well, first of all, I did a Wall Street Journal op-ed in the fall of 2019 entitled, "If we can land a man on the moon, we can launch the dollar into cyberspace." And our vision is that the future of value is going to increasingly move off the balance sheets of proprietary commercial institutions, increasingly on-chain in both distributed and decentralized and centralized networks. And some of those centralized networks will be operated by governments, and some will be run by private sector firms, and in many cases, big tech firms. And so how do you future-proof the dollar? A dollar that I believe for the last 30 years has been a net good, not just for Americans, but for the global world. In fact, the basis for globalization and more people rising out of poverty than ever before around the world, the dollar's been there as a stable store of value. So where value increasingly moves to a on-chain basis, how do we protect the dollar? How do we preserve its role as a reserve currency? And that was the argument we made, that the United States government needs to be on the front foot. We need to bring democratic values to the future of value and not sit back and let our economic competitors, and worse, our economic adversaries, set the terms, set the values of money of the future. And so we launched the Digital Dollar Project to ask this very question. We're nonprofit, we're nonpartisan. We take no view of whether whether the US should deploy a CBDC or not deploy a CBDC. We don't get into the debate of whether stablecoin's good, stablecoin's bad, CBDC good. That, to us, quite frankly, that's a false choice. The fact of the matter is the future will have both stablecoins and CBDC. There's no getting away from it. We can ban CBDC in Florida or in the United States, and yet Americans are going to be dealing with CBDC around the world for generations to come. Over 130 countries, over 95% of the world's GDP is now experimenting with CBDC. There is already a digital yuan in 240 million wallets, and that's a two-year-old figure. The digital euro is coming. A digital pound is coming. So even if we don't do a digital dollar, we're going to be dealing with CBDC. Secondly, stablecoins are coming. Terrific panel on here. There's so much thoughtful work, so much intelligent work being put into this. There's a stable coin bill coming. 5 years ago, there was less than $3 billion in total stable coin in value. Today, there's $250 billion. Over 14 trillion in on-chain transactions in stable coins. So let's get beyond this CBDC versus stable coins. Our future is going to have both. And the question we ask is, what about the dollar? How do we preserve its role in this global future?
So I'll carry on the crypto dad analogy, since you earned that moniker a few years ago. And when I think about our conversations around CBDCs and kind of your approach here, I almost think crypto dad saying, I know you're going to drink, I'd rather you do it in the house and I'll take the keys, right? And a lot of what you've spoken about is preserving privacy in a CBDC construct, right? So your starting point is a little different than I think some folks in this room, which is fight this, tooth and nail. And yours is, this is inevitable. How do we make sure that this eventuality includes privacy protections and is kind of built at its core to not be a nightmare scenario.
Right. So there's one benchmark CBDC right now, and that's the digital yuan, the ECNY.
Yep.
And it has certain values attached to it. One of the values, or some of the values, are censorship and surveillance. That model is there. And for some strange reason, whenever Americans talk about CBDC, they assume that is the model that we would adopt in a democratic free society. Well, the United States didn't vanquish the Soviet Union by emulating its command and control centralized economy. It didn't vanquish the Soviet Union by becoming Marxist-Leninist ourselves. We vanquished the Soviet Union by sticking true to our free market, free speech, constitutional principles. Well, why would we not do the same thing if we develop a CBDC? And are you telling me we don't have enough brain power to design a CBDC that is operationally transparent and preserving of privacy and anti-censorship? Of course we could. That technology exists. We can build a CBDC that is true to our values. And if we did, the world would flock to it. Not necessarily because of its value, but because of its values. And the same applies to stablecoins. Not enough is being done, and quite frankly, I'll criticize the stablecoin legislation in this regard. It doesn't require a high enough degree of privacy. If I'm a common citizen, I'd be asking myself, am I any more secure with stablecoins than this Chinese notion of CBDC? I think as a free society, what we should be demanding is any form of digital money actually have even more privacy than our existing analog system, which the dirty little secret is, it's heavily surveilled. In fact, I say the debate over CBDC and stablecoins ought to be an opportunity for we, the people, to actually raise our voices about the already existing degree of surveillance and censorship that takes place, and demand that a digital future return us to our core values of economic liberty and economic freedom.
To me, I mean, do you agree that this is probably the most high-stakes conversation that we're going to have as a community? Because I can't think of a bigger issue when it comes to privacy and kind of constitutional protections than a CBDC where the wrong levers are pulled, right? Where the Chinese levers are pulled in the US versus some of what the parameters that you're talking about. So, I guess the question that always comes up for me is, okay, if we advance this, what protects the people from a couple of rogue regulators, not naming any names, but we know that this can happen, from pulling the levers to make this fully surveilled, permissioned, political, and actually the worst possible flavor of a CBDC versus something that is actually going to be an upgrade over the existing system.
Right. So again, the Chinese model is one where censorship and surveillance is built in. And believe me, that's not going to stay within Chinese borders. I predict, and you'll hear me now on stage, mark my words, within the end of the decade, there will be a digital bolivar, and it will basically be a white label version of the digital yuan. And it won't end with that country. Many countries around the world desire to surveil their citizens, and the available technology will be provided to them by the People's Bank of China. The world is going to be a series of decentralized, where they're not suppressed by governments, as in China, but also centralized digital money systems. And whenever you create that centralized system, you create massive honeypots of information that can be purloined, that can be abused by the controllers of the system, whether those are private actors or government actors. And we all need to be concerned about that future. We need to raise our voices, and we cannot fall into, I say, a false choice that say, well, let just the private sector do it. Because how's that worked out in free speech? We've seen and we know that our government, and it doesn't even need to get political, politicians will lean on social media platforms to suppress certain speech. Well, it's not a big intellectual jump to say they'll do the same thing with private sector stablecoin operators to lean on them to ban certain activities. And the biggest disappointment to me in that stablecoin bill is it doesn't prevent the government from doing it. So if you're worried about privacy in CBDC, one should be just as worried about it in anyone. And whether that's even, that may be a digital euro, a digital pound, we've got to be concerned about. So the only way to fix this, I think, is technologically. The systems that are utilized, whether by governments or stablecoin operators, should be operationally transparent, and the obligations of non-censorship, non-surveillance should be built in and observable to all users of this.
Is this simply a naming issue in some respects? Because, I think when you lay out your case and kind of your vision for, the different flavors of CBDCs, the different flavors of stablecoins, and what are some of the common protections that need to be built in, it sounds very reasonable, but CBDCs, I think, are just so politically toxic right now in the U.S., particularly on the right. And we have some excellent congressmen and, to your point, governors that are saying, absolutely not. This has now become, literally a four-letter word, but it's like verboten to actually support something like this. So is the reframing essentially digital dollars, and some of them are going to be private, and some of them are going to be Fed issued, right? Is that the breakdown, and is there a way to kind of reset this conversation, or do you think that we're just going to be in this stalemate for the next several years? And ultimately, the other downside is losing ground, to your point. If we don't have any frameworks that come out of the U.S., now everyone is just forking the code base from China.
Yeah.
Right?
So I think what's happening in the United States right now is both sides are talking past each other, which they usually do. On the right side, but not limited to the right, because Robert Kennedy is as concerned about this as is Governor DeSantis. On the right is this legitimate concern about privacy. It is a very real and a very right concern, but it applies to all forms of digital money, not just to CBDC. On the left side is a concern about, well, if not a CBDC, how do we make sure that we project the dollar into this digital future? And I'm not sure it has to be a US digital dollar or a US CBDC. But we do need to work past this Washington divide and really think about the values of money. What made the dollar the aspirational currency since World War II is its stability, is its liquidity, but also the values associated with it. The values of a free market economy, of free trade, of free enterprise, of entrepreneurship. Those are the values that if we get them into the digital money of the future, people around the world will flock to. People will flee a digital bolivar, will flee a digital yuan to the extent they can, and go to this currency. And I argue that up till now, what's made the dollar so powerful is the value. In the future, what will make the dollar so powerful is the values. And the same obligation to protect those values needs to be placed on both private operators, and if the Fed does do a CBDC, on them as well.
Privacy is a double-edged sword, right? So on the other side, the folks that are in the surveillance state and that whole apparatus, crypto is a threat to the third-party doctrine, right? And we get beaten up all the time for North Korea hackers have exploited this DeFi protocol, and so the crypto bros basically just gave them $100 million for ballistic missile. And there's legitimate concerns, obviously there, but how do we square some of what you're talking about, privacy and actually like imbuing, whether it's stablecoins or CBDCs with these, kind of privacy protections, and the 100% certain pushback that you're going to see from the financial regulators, particularly in Treasury, to not being able to see that because the less surveillance we have, the more in danger we are, and that whole kind of line of thinking.
So it's actually...
We've only lost ground in the last 30, 40 years
yes,
in that direction. Yeah.
Democracies have had this balance in their DNA going back several centuries now. To the original common law notion that one had a right to privacy. A man's home or a woman's home is their castle.
Yep.
And the government needed to show probable cause of law breaking, and in many cases get a subpoena to be able to invade that privacy.
Probable cause, what's that?
A probable cause that something is going wrong here, right? Not that we're going to know everybody's information in case they do something wrong,
Yep.
but where there's a reason to believe, a reasonable reason to believe, then we can invade that privacy. What's happened in the last 30 years, since the Bank Secrecy Act and certainly since 9/11, we've moved away from that to a system where we're going to gather everybody's information in case they do something wrong. And that's happening now. More and more information is being delivered by banks and financial service firms to the government, certainly on global transactions, we've seen this, in case people do something wrong. That's really gotten us far away from our core value democratic principles. We need to return to that, and here's the point. In a digital future, we can, because governments don't need to gather all this information. They can become nodes on blockchains where they can observe volume information. They can do big data analysis, and they can look for patterns. And when they see patterns that demonstrably demonstrate the probability of law breaking, then we can have a system of subpoenas where they can unmask that activity. So we can still balance law enforcement with a digital future without needing to do the amount of data transmission that's currently siphoned off the government every day. You know, it's funny, in Europe, Europeans are hyper about commercial usurpation of data, but hand it over to the government. GDPR doesn't cover government. In the United States, we're hyper about government invading our privacy, but we hand over all our data to private sector firms, and we need to not make that mistake in the future.
You know, I know you didn't teach a course on blockchain at MIT, but you certainly sound quite a bit more proficient in terms of what's actually going on. How did the SEC get so far off the rails? I'll leave it open. I'm not gonna push you to get yourself into trouble. I'll do that myself on Twitter, again as the representative of crypto Twitter. But do you agree that they're off the rails at this point?
Here's what I'd say, Ryan. There's actually two American models of handle crypto. One is the CFTC model, and the other one is the SEC model. In 2017, the CFTC launched Lab CFTC, a year before the SEC even thought about FinHub. And Lab CFTC was leading the 5 CFTC commissioners in doing synthetic Bitcoin mining in the chairman's conference room in the summer of 2017. Why? Because the agency wanted to understand the technology in order to interact with it. In the fall of 2017, the CFTC greenlighted the launch of Bitcoin futures, the first fully regulated crypto product anywhere, almost anywhere, certainly in the United States. And 5 years later, it's liquid, it's well regulated, it's transparent, and it's working well. What did the CFTC do? It engaged with crypto by bringing it into the regulatory framework, not giving it the Heisman and forcing it out. Then there's the SEC model, which is the Heisman and enforcement. I don't have to deliberately compare and contrast. I'll let your audience do the same. But I would argue that the proof of the success of Bitcoin futures, we just had on the stage my successor, Heath Tarbert, as chairman of the CFTC. He oversaw the green light of Ethereum futures. Those products are working not only so well, not only well, but so well that the few things that the SEC has approved, Bitcoin futures, ETFs, are based upon the CFTC product set. So I would argue that there's two models, and the right model happens to be the one I had the honor to serve as chairman over.
Well, we're right about at time, but I want everybody to help me manifest President Ramaswamy and SEC Chair Giancarlo. That would be a beautiful thing, maybe. So,
thank you.
Or some flavor of that,
Thank you so much.
at least more open-mindedness. So thank you. It's always a pleasure.